This is the story of CAAC Flight 301. Wow, this video is really a blast from the past. CAAC Flight 301 was operated by CAAC, an airline that no longer exists, from the old Guangzhou Baiyun International Airport, which no longer exists, to Hong Kong's Kaitak International Airport, which no longer exists, using a Hawker Siddeley Trident, which, as you guessed, no longer exists. The world that this flight operated in does not exist anymore. And maybe with the way that this flight ended, that's probably a good thing. On the 31st of August 1988, a Hawker Siddeley Trident took on 78 passengers at Guangzhou Baiyun Airport for the quick 30-minute hop over to Hong Kong. The plane took off with no issues. A little bit past midnight, the plane contacted Hong Kong approach control. The information that they got was not encouraging. They had some bad weather in the way. Flight 301 asked the controllers if they could deviate 12 miles to the left of the track to avoid some nasty looking clouds. That request was approved, but the bad news kept on coming. The crew at this point were hoping to make an IGS, or Instrument Guidance System, approach to runway 13. This is the famous right turn landing that kaitak is known for. And ILS can't be used here because ILS only works for straight-in approaches. The 13 at kaitak was anything but straight in. That's why they had to use an IGS instead of an ILS approach. ATC now had its work cut out for them. They needed to accommodate Flight 301 on its way into runway 31, and they had planes departing from runway 13. Here's how all of this would work out. Flight 301 was heading due west, and a controller had a departing airplane, so he would let the plane fly through the extended centerline of runway 31 and then make a right-hand turn to get Flight 301 onto the localizer. Eventually, the plane was asked to turn right to 360 or due north to intercept the localizer. From there, it would be a simple landing, or as simple a landing could be in weather this bad. As the jet lined up with the runway, the controllers tried to lock onto the jet with precision approach radar, a radar system that would give them precise reading on where the plane was on its approach to runway 31. But the rain was so heavy that it was interfering with the precision approach radar, and it could not lock onto the plane. So, the controllers let the pilots know that the precision approach control was not working. The plane was 12 nautical miles from the runway, but the jet was cleared to land, and they should still be able to make this approach given the weather at the time. The pilots acknowledged the landing clearance. As the plane got lower and slower, things started to go wrong. The plane was no longer level, and the right wing was down, so low that it started to hit the approach lights. Right as this happened, the right main landing gear slammed into the lip of the seawall. The right main landing gear, its support structure, sections of the wing, and the inboard flaps were all ripped from the plane as it slammed into the ground. The left main gear hit the ground and the plane bounced. The plane tracked to the right and slid across the airport as what remained of the plane fell into Kowloon Bay. A fire duty officer who was on call that night saw the plane come in at a weird angle, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. He hit the crash alarm, and within a minute, emergency services were at the wreck. But despite the quick reaction of the airport emergency personnel, 6 members of the crew and 1 passenger had died. Finding out what happened to Flight 301 would be a challenge, as none of the crew survived. The Hawker Siddeley was not equipped with a cockpit voice recorder. Moreover, the jet had a very primitive flight data recorder, and finding out what had happened from that would be a challenge in and of itself. Thus, we don't know exactly what transpired in the cockpit in those final moments, but the investigators would try their best to piece together what happened from the little flight data that they did have. To get every bit of data out of the wreck, they started studying the last displayed values on the cockpit instruments. The descent rate indicators turned out to be a dud. The left instrument showed a descent rate of 6,000 feet per minute, and the right one showed a descent rate of 30 foot per minute. The vibrations of the crash had wiped away the last real bit of information that the dials ever showed. The gauges were examined thoroughly, and it was shown that they were functional before the crash. This wasn't a case of a broken gauge leading the pilots astray. The throttles also told an interesting story. The left engine was found to be fully closed. The right and the center one were found to be forward with the thrust reversers disabled. This told the story of a pilot that was fighting to right the plane once the plane had started to yaw to the right once it was on the ground, attempting to use the thrust of the plane to gain some sort of control authority. But that's all the cockpit told them. With the wreck in shallow waters, they were able to go through the wreck with a fine-tooth comb. They found that the plane was structurally sound before the crash. The engines, the structure, all of it checked out. This plane was perfectly flyable till the moment that it flew into that seawall. That now meant that we have to look at the weather. The plane crashed in heavy rain with an RVR, or visibility, of 1,000 meters. Did the pilots have enough information to make an informed decision to land at this airport in such bad weather? Well, the pilots knew that they had some bad weather at the runway. In fact, at 12:47 a.m., the controller said, quote, "On my radar, there is weather between Charlie Hotel and the 270 radial up to Lima Tango. If you prefer, you can have runway 31 monitored ILS approach. The surface wind is between 090 to 140 degrees at 10 knots. Heavy shower over the airfield. The visibility on runway 31 is 5,000 meters. On the IGS is 3,000 meters. Advise." End quote. This is when they decided to go for runway 31. As the plane flew the approach, two versions of the ATIS weather report came out, Echo and Foxtrot. The controller passed the following information from the Foxtrot broadcast to the pilots. Wind 120 to 150, 5 to 10 knots, runway surface wet, visibility 4,500, rain. End quote. But one thing that wasn't passed on was the possibility of wind shear at the end of ATIS Foxtrot. Moreover, as they were flying the ILS approach, the visibility fell all the way down to 1,000 meters, and no one told them about this. In the control tower, as all of this was happening, an ATC officer was undergoing approach control rating, and that made all of this that much harder. The head controller was asked why the changes were not transmitted to the plane, and his reasoning was that the weather was changing so quickly that it would not have made sense to transmit the changes, as the weather would be out of date by the time the pilots took action. Let me know if you buy into that. So, how badly did the weather affect Flight 301? As Flight 301 was coming in, the visibility was all over the place, and the winds were starting to pick up. The wind would have changed from a south-southeast to a northeast wind very quickly. This would have meant that the plane would have suddenly had a sizable tailwind in the last 200 feet of the approach. The flight path of the plane from 500 feet sure does look a lot like it encountered a wind shear. First, the plane went above the glide slope and the airspeed decreased. The pitch was reduced, and then the plane dropped below the glide slope. There are a couple of explanations as to why this happened. One is that they applied too much power in the final section of the approach, and they were not able to correct for their mistake. The other explanation is that they indeed were caught in a wind shear event, but they didn't recognize it as such, as they had not been given flight simulator training on how to deal with the wind shear. They had extensive classes on wind shear, but they had not had any simulator training. Now add to this the fact that the plane's wipers were being hit with rain that they couldn't clear in time, meaning that the pilots could barely see out of the plane, then you can start to see how things can unravel for the pilots of Flight 301. The visibility is bad, they can barely see out of their plane, and the plane is just being pushed around, and they're falling below the glide slope. One thing after another, it just keeps building. Now we're getting a clearer idea of what happened in the final moments of Flight 301. The plane first went over the glide slope at 850 feet. This could have been caused by winds. Pilots have said that an easterly wind usually pushes you around a little bit here. Then by 600 feet, the plane was on the glide slope again, but it had picked up some speed. They were now starting to float above the glide slope again. This is when the approach path started to steepen and speed began to bleed off. The plane entered a steep rate of descent. At 300 feet, the plane went right through the glide slope, and there was no attempt to maintain the glide slope. They kept descending until the plane hit the approach lights. The second excursion from the flight path, the one where they were above the flight path, is much harder to explain. Maybe the pilot raised the nose in order to prevent an overspeed. Remember, the plane was picking up speed, Or maybe it was wind shear at play. Or maybe they were disoriented. Either way, they went right through the glide slope and hit the lights. They might not have even seen it coming. But this, as far as we know, is all we'll ever know about Flight 301. The data just isn't there to get a clear idea. One final thing that I want to bring up about Flight 301 is how the cockpit was organized. There were 6 people in the cockpit. This is one more than the Hawker Siddeley Trident is designed for. One pilot was sitting on a stool that was unsecured, and that's where he sat throughout the entire accident sequence. I'm just bringing that up because that was mentioned in the accident report. I don't know if that played a part in their cockpit culture or their work culture. That is for you to interpret and let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. Thank you and stay safe. I'll catch you guys next time.